Hello, I welcome everybody who has joined us. My name is Olga Tamanova from the Media Center Ukraine in Ukrinform. We are going on with our work today. This is the 169th day since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and today we will be speaking about the events at the front line as of now. So now we are beginning with our briefings of the security and defense forces, and our first speaker is Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Hanna Mahler. So please, what has taken place during this week in the Ministry of Defense? Hello. We don't only have the news of the week, but also every Thursday we can hear the freshest news, because here we have just adapted to them. So now you will hear the news which no one has heard before. So we have the 169th day of defense of Ukraine, our heroic repulsion of the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation. This week is significant, unfortunately, with massive missile strikes against peaceful Ukrainian cities and nuclear blackmailing from Russia. The settlements are on fire along the contact line because of the Russian missiles. Vinnytsia, Uman and other cities were affected, and one of the critical points is Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But we, however, are still united, and we are still will get to the victory over the Russian occupiers. We are all together. Every single person on his or her front line, we are still not tired to protect Ukraine. The militarily political superiors of our state is doing everything possible to make our victory closer. During these minutes, in Denmark, we have the Copenhagen Conference of the Northern European allies to support Ukraine. We have high expectations and optimism in the increase of support of Ukraine. Our state is represented by the Minister of Defense, Oleksii. Oleksii Yurievich yesterday had an opportunity to communicate with his Danish colleague, Morten Beskov, and for the perspective bilateral cooperation, in particular in the preparation of and training of the staff of the armed forces of Ukraine, the leadership courses for junior commanders, the training on the demining experts on both on land and in the maritime, and also the mechanized training of the brigades. This week, as for the provision of our defenders, we have some of the achievements. The Canadian partners are renovating the operation of Unifier. 225 Canadian servicemen are sent to the UK to train our servicemen. Sweden, Finland, and the Kingdom of Denmark are joining the program of training of Ukrainian warriors under the patronage of the United Kingdom. Yes, really, with such a support, our servicemen will become the unstoppable force, and it's one more step to strengthen the eastern flank of NATO to restore peace and security in Europe. We will prevail over Russian tyranny together. Whatever the enemy is trying to break us, we still have to fight back. We have to prove that the freedom is always prevailing. Yes, that is exhausting, it is not easy, but just acting together, step by step, we will overcome Russian occupiers and we will get out of this war as the winners. Separately, I'm speaking with the residents of the rare cities and villages. In spite of the formal silence in your cities, the active phase of the war is ongoing, and sometimes the cruelty of Russian criminals is still increasing. Please fight at the economic, informational, diplomatic, and all the other possible front lines. The test of war is common for all of us. Today, every single one of us is a warrior, and our victory will be common. The armed forces know what they do, and the huge volume of information is not beyond the affordable during the wartime. You need to understand that the victory will be ours. During a week, the security situation around Ukraine was still complicated but under control. The armed forces and other armed formations of Russian Federation went on to accomplish the tasks to destruct the formations of defense forces of Ukraine at the eastern direction, the southern direction, and in more details you will hear that from the representative of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. During the week, the main forces and efforts of the adversary were focused mostly on the east, and the attempts of the enemy to move deeper into Donetsk region did not have any success, were failing. Simultaneously, there was the increase of the losses of the Russian occupational troops in the live force. Because of that, the commandment of the armed forces of Russian Federation is expanding the practice of the delaying of the rotation of the leading units for the non-defined terms without the additional manning of the staff. And according to the data of the main intelligence department, we can see the decrease of the manning of the units of the occupier with human resources, which impacts the morale of the Russian servicemen and so-called volunteers, and deteriorates their motivation in the participants in the combats against Ukraine. Considering the above mentioned, the occupiers are urgently taking the total forced mobilization on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, having the mass raids and detaining the men to send them to the warfare. The hidden aim of the mass involvement of the citizens of Ukraine into the Russian occupational troops is the wish of the Russian superiors to compromise some part of the population of the occupied Ukrainian territory with the blood of the killed compatriots, and to form and to shape further on the controlled layer of the society at the expense of their collaborators. Altogether, the occupiers are not conceding the formality of the so-called referendum. They understood that to conduct the referendum is just not possible, and to hide the fact that the so-called referendum will be formal, and in fact it will be just some theater piece, nothing more. In particular, they announced that in lots of settlements there won't be any of the electoral units. Instead of the voting, the representatives of the local occupational administrations will come to the homes of the citizens together with the Russian servicemen, with the presence of so-called voters. They will as if vote. We are now coming to the traditional block of information about the provision of the armed forces of Ukraine. During the period from the 4th till the 10th of August, the Ministry of Defense, to provide the units of the armed forces of Ukraine, has delivered more than 17,000 of armored vests, more than 33,000 of helmets, more than 18,000 of boot spares, and more than 10,000 of uniforms sets. So the rhythm and tempo of deliveries is still at the same level as for the individual armored protection. We are foreseeing the similar indicators because we have awarded lots of contracts with different suppliers, and according to the schedule, they are totally accomplished. There can be more armored vests this week or that week, or the same concerns the helmets. For instance, there used to be 10,000 pair of boots, and this week we have almost 19,000 pair of boots. But the balance is still there, and we have the reserve of dozens of thousands of units of helmets and armored vests. Altogether, as I already mentioned last time, we are following the dynamic of approximately 40 main positions of the things and equipment of the armed forces of Ukraine. We have the contracts within the needs which are formed by the General Staff. Everything depends on the available resources further on. As for the money, as you know, during the previous months, we have created the speed, the tempo for the first half of the month to transfer the money for the servicemen, for the monthly money provision for the servicemen, that is so-called money of the peaceful time. Those are salaries, those are the payments for the military ranks and the experience. And during the second part of the month, we financed additional payments for the service during the martial law and for in fact, the participants in the combats, 30 and 100,000. This month, we're expecting for all of the payments to come in the end of August. So the payments by the Ministry of Defense have been done, the calculations have been done, which is connected to the procedures of the amendments to the state budget, the law which has to be adopted by the parliament. We all understand that this is the urgent situation in the economy. Lots of complicated issues which are now being solved by the government. But under these conditions, the defense is still the irrevocable priority. So our warriors will get all the necessary payments, but some of them will come 2-3 weeks later than it has been foreseen. So I will remind you that during the July, in comparison with June, we are expecting for the increase of the payments for approximately 15%. That is, altogether, it is expecting at the level of 70 billion hryvnia. As for our legal frontline, judicial frontline, and informational frontline, today we have already mentioned that during the several last weeks in a row, the armed forces of Ukraine are keeping the powerful defense in the east, and the enemy is becoming nervous. We can see this nervousness not only in their maneuvering, but also in their informational field. In particular, we are seeing the informational attacks against our military superiors, military political superiors of our state, and one of the commanders, whom really Russians are afraid of. What's the tactics of the Russians? They are trying to create quarrels between our military heads. They are just injecting some of the rumors, kind of compromises, though this is a totally fake information, taking into account that in spite of our warnings, lots of Ukrainian citizens are subscribing for Russian Telegram channels. They can see this information and the Russians use it. So I'm asking all of you, please come to the website of the Ministry of Defense and our web pages, find this huge list which has been published by all of the security and defense forces, more than 100 of Telegram channels which the Russians are disseminating among the Ukrainians. This is their key source of information through which they are trying to impact onto our military command. But these tools are very simple and primitive. We understand them, though they don't impact us. But just for you to know, we just make you aware about that. As for the judicial and legal front line, the legal service of the Ministry of Defense has had certain measures to take payments for the inappropriate contract obligations from the deals of the economic entities. Weekly, we provide this information because the legal service of the Ministry of Defense is conducting the whole campaign to stop the schemes which used to work before, which were basing upon the deals but without the obligations done. They laundered some of the money from the, or property from the subordination of the Ministry of Defense. Today, everything is coming back to the ministry. On the 3rd of August, the Economic Court of the Dnipropetrovsk region had the court verdict for the Ministry of Defense, and the economic entity had to pay 4.4 billion hryvnia for the inappropriate deal obligations, as for the untimely and not full delivery of the fuel oil products. We're speaking about diesel fuel and the special fuel for the military equipment. Besides that, the Cassation Economic Court still has the verdict of the Northern Economic Court as for the 44 billion hryvnia of fines for the inappropriate conditions of the contract on the repairment and improvement of the military equipment. Besides that, you know that we are bringing back the lands for the Ministry of Defense and the premises which were illegally taken. For instance, on the 3rd of August, By the verdict of the Economic Court of the Kyiv region, the for court's file of the contract was done as for the land lot of 2.4 hectares, which they foresaw to create the residential block. But the construction works were not starting and these lands were not used. I'm speaking about Sotsmistechko in Borispil town. And finally, let's speak about our common work with the security service of Ukraine at the information frontline. The Ministry of Defense, together with the Security Service of Ukraine, is working to prevent and counter the leakage of the important military information, in particular through the media and other public communications. We have already been coming to the media and all of our citizens to inform them that the turnover of the information in the public space during the martial law is different from the peaceful time. We are not speaking about censorship. We are speaking that all of us shouldn't harm with our information. We shouldn't harm the armed forces of Ukraine to protect Ukraine. The leakage of such information can stop the plans of the armed forces of Ukraine because the enemy is correcting its actions and using this information against us. So, several days ago, the Department of Counterintelligence of the Security Service of Ukraine has found out that in the interview of the serviceman to the famous publication, there is some information which, according to some of the symptoms, is discovering and revealing the operational and strategic plans of the armed forces of Ukraine, the issues of training, organization, and military warfare. As for this fact, we are investigating according to the legislation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Hanna. I would like to give the floor to Oleksii Hromov, Deputy Head of the Main Operations Directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the Brigade General, and let's speak in more details about the situation at the front line. What is happening now? Hello. The adversary is going on to accomplish their tasks to get to the administrative borders of Donetsk region, to have the borders of the part of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Mykolaiv regions. And also the creation of favorable conditions for it to provide offensive. In comparison with the last week, the aggressor has doubled the number of aviation and aircraft hits against our positions and civilian infrastructure. Still, the aircrafts and helicopters of the adversary are avoiding of getting our air defense. So the results of these shellings are low, so it's more of a psychological impact against our servicemen. During the times of the so-called special operation, the defense forces of Ukraine have inflicted lots of losses for our adversary. Now the aggressor is going on to with the manning of their reserves. So the issue of the manning of the units is they try to solve it appointing the former sergeants who had special officers courses in their curriculum. So the special units are consisting of so-called volunteers, approximately 60%. Those volunteers had the short-term contracts. And 40% are the servicemen who have already taken part in the combats in Ukraine. The morale of so-called volunteers is satisfactory, but of the staff which has the experience in Ukraine is low. So they are trying to get to the rare units and the provision units. At the temporarily occupied territories in Lugansk region, the forced mobilization of the population is going on to go on with the manning, the mobilization units of the 2nd Army Corps of the Russian troops. The Russian occupational administration is planning to conscript 8,000 people. This is the population of their little settlement. Simultaneously, the repression is ongoing as for the highest military command and officers of the Russian Federation armed troops through the failures of the strategic plan. Because of the failing of the strategic plans, the Minister of Defense of Russia, Shoigu, and General Gerasimov are staying at the positions just to prevent the discrediting of the highest military ranking of Russia. Approximately 30 to 40% of generals and officers who took part in the planning of the special military operation are suspended from their obligations and are now under investigation. Taking into account the explosions which took place at the airdromes of Saki and Zabrivka, we are awaiting for the new staff decisions as for the superiors. During the week, the main efforts of the Kremlin were focused on the combats at the east of our state, first and foremost at Bakhmut, Kramatorsk and Avdiivka directions. We can see the increase of the forces at Novopavlivka direction of Donetsk operational region. The adversary is regrouping the aviation component of the eastern part for the operational airdromes of the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, but because of the recent events, the further plans are not known. During the week, the adversary went on with the missile hits against our territory, including from the territory of Republic of Belarus. At the northern western direction of our state, there are no signs of offensive of the adversary. As of now, the situation is characterized as stable and under control. The groups and formations of the troops of armed forces of Ukraine are stabilizing the operation in Chernihiv, Sumy and Rivne regions. During the border of Ukraine, in the border regions, we have 6 battalions of the armed forces of Belarus. According to the available data, Russia is going on to involve Belarus in the full-scale war against Ukraine. According to the preliminary data, up to 13,000 persons out of the acting and ex-servicemen of the Belarusian special forces have signed the agreement to take part in the war against Ukraine. The main motive is material and financial. Not a single ideological component can be found. No one believes in any denazification, the protection of the rights of Russian-speaking people, and so on. Fear and money are the main factors of Russian military presence. The aggressor is inviting to the polygons of Belarus the foreign representatives as well. On the 3rd of August, the airdrome Machulishi of Minsk region, the first foreign commands from Russian Federation, from Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Cameroon, Laos, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Syria and Mali came to Belarus. On the 8th of August, we could see the Ryazan airborne university, and all of that is done for the picture of the so-called international cooperation of the aggressor. In the army trainings of 2022, which is planned for the aggressor since the 13th to the 21st of August, they have foreseen the participants of the 37 regions and countries. We cannot know the aim of the so-called games on the territory of Belarus, the authorities of which is accusing Ukraine and the West in the opportunity to impact their management. So why don't they do at the polygon of Alabino? Why do they do those games just before the Independence Day of Ukraine? According to some of the assessment of the experts, they are not excluding that there can be sabotage with some of the victims among the foreigners to demonize Ukrainians and to accuse us in all of the possible sins, to create another substantiation to involve the Belarusians into the bloody plans of Putin. As for Chernihiv and Sumy directions, we're going on with the rotation of the armed forces of Russia, which are in the borderline regions of Bryansk region. They have up to 5 battalion tactical groups there, and because of this rotation, the enemy can increase their military presence in these directions. Besides that, in Bryansk region of Russia, up to 22nd of August, they have the yellow, that is high level of terroristic threat. During the week, the adversary had artillery and mine-throwing shellings around Zalizny Mist, Mykolaiivka, Gaisin, Kyiv regions of Chernihiv region, and Sredina Buda, Pavlivka, Brusky, Mazenivka, Mikhalchina Sloboda of Sumy region. So altogether, the enemy has conducted 63 shellings of the position of our troops. Besides that, the adversary has actively had the air intelligence with the use of the aircrafts, mostly in the regions of the settlements of Zelený Mist, Velika Pisarivka, Shaligine, Stargorod.
На Харківському напрямку.
As for Kharkiv direction, the main efforts are at the retaining of the territories without getting our troops to the borders. They had the small arms artillery, the MLRSs using the cluster armaments and missiles against the positions in Svitlichna, Sosnovka, Petomnik, Ruski Tяжки, Циркуни, Mospanowe, Pecheneghi, Bazalivka, Peremoga. The enemy has had aircraft hits in Verkhny Saltiv, Bayrak, Priship, Mospanova, Stary Saltiv, and also missile strikes against Kharkiv, Chuguyev and Kochetkov of Kharkiv region. The defense forces during this period have conducted the deterring and sometimes offensive actions to restore the lost positions. At Slavyansk direction, the enemy has focused its efforts on the retention of the positions, finding the weak and narrow places in our defense, and to restore offensive in Slavyansk direction, using the small arms and artillery against the positions of our troops around Dolina, Adamivka, Krasnopilla, Vernopilla, Mazanivka and Rusanivka. They also had aircraft strikes against Bohorodichne, Ivanodarivka, Grigorivka, and also missile strikes against Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Around Bohorodichne and the National Reserve Park Svety Hory, they used saboteur intelligence groups. During the week, the adversary went on with the offensive in Kramatorsk, Bakhmut and Avdiivka directions with the aim to take under control the settlements of Soledar, Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Pisky. During the week, the adversary is not stopping to storm and provide offensive around Pisky, providing up to 6 to 7 attacks from the in the scale of the regiment during the day. Even today, the occupier had 7 attempts during the offensive, and between them, our defenders are shelled by the aircrafts and artillery. The military superiors have had reserves for the partial rotation. Simultaneously, we should mention that the outcomes of the warfare by our units. Yesterday, around the settlement of Pisky and Spartak, the servicemen of the land forces have destroyed 4 tanks and life force of the occupier. And around the settlement of Yegorivka, in the direction of Vuhledar, they destroyed 7 tanks and 3 armored infantry vehicles. In the eastern direction, we have destroyed 12 tanks of the occupier. The intensity of the shellings of the occupiers of the positions of our troops is rather high still. The occupier is going on with the shellings of the infrastructure of Ukrainian cities. The enemy is shelling with the aircrafts around Soledar, Yakovlivka and others, Bakhmutske and Zaitsevo. And the missile hits were done around Kostantinivka, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Siversk. And even the heads of the so-called People's Republics know the barbarian consequences of the Russian world. One of them mentioned that Popasna is fully destroyed and the restoration may not take place. There is no sense to restore it, they said. As for Zaporizhia direction, the adversary did not provide offensive. To deter the actions of our troops, they used artillery shellings along the front line and contact line. They were using aircrafts around Novosilka, Novodanilivka, Malisherbaki. They provided missile strikes around Zaporizhia, Trudove. At the southern direction of the warcraft, the situation is characterized as stable and under control. Still, the adversary is going on to strengthen and reinforce their troops at Kryvyi Rih and Mykolaiv directions. The main forces are around the positions without letting our troops to get deeper into their defense. To inflict losses, they shelled the small arms and artillery along the whole contact line. They went on with the missile and aircraft strikes around the settlements of infrastructure in Mykolaiv and Odessa regions. The vast majority of the strikes were against Mykolaiv and the attached regions. As for Kherson direction, the defense forces are having the platform at the left bank of the Ingulets River around Andriivka and Belohivka, and they are providing measures to improve the operational situation. In the northern western part of the Black Sea, they cover the shore communications with the ports of Chornomorsk, Odessa, Pivdenny, and Nadtochyi, and the base from the sea. Since the beginning of August, the sea corridor from the Ukrainian ports of Chornomorsk, Odessa, and Pivdenny, we had the transfer of 12 ships to the Mediterranean Sea and 2 ships to the port of Chornomorsk. So altogether, the humanitarian corridor of the Ukrainian port have delivered approximately 375,000 tons of the grains, freights, and other food products. There were no obstacles for this in this corridor for the ships. During the week, the number of the destroyed cruise missiles was 3 of 5, that is 60%. During this period, the forces to the anti-missiles of troops, they destroyed 27 air targets. Because of the substantial losses of the aviation equipment of the air forces, they are considering to involve the obsolete fighter jets Su-24M, which since 2005-2018 were not used by the aggressor. Moreover, according to the experience of the exploitants of the China of Su-35 of Soviet production, they found out the low level of quality and reliability of these aircrafts. As of December 2021, out of 24 aircrafts delivered to China, only 9 of them were working. There were more than 950 reclamation acts. And the biggest failures of the works of Su-35 were at the systems and the radar stations, according to the assessment of the experts. The problems of reliability and quality of the aircraft equipment of Russian production are systematic and relevant for all of the military aircrafts of Russian Federation. According to the experience of the warfare, the aircrafts Su-35 also showed the low level of durability. Since the beginning of the armed aggression, they've lost almost 2 aviation, the more than 24 aircrafts of this type. The helicopters of Army Aviation have inflicted more than 260 aircraft hits against the adversary. We have some achievements, we have some results. According to the achieved agreements between the United Kingdom and Ukraine, we still go on with the trainings of our servicemen. Now 2,400 servicemen have been trained, and 2,400 more servicemen are being trained, and we're also planning to send almost 5,000 of servicemen more. The first servicemen who had this kind of training are already successful with their military missions within the brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine, making our victory closer. It's obvious that where the Russian troops can be found, where the Russian base of adversary can be found, it cannot be safe. It's well known all over the world, and even the higher powers are helping us to restore justice. The armed forces of Ukraine need help of all of the forces of good, both of our citizens and the partner countries and the citizens of Russia and Belarus, the ones who have Ukraine in their heart, believe in God and the armed forces of Ukraine. Thank you. Now Oleksii Nadtochyi, head of the operations office of the main directorate of the National Guard of Ukraine, the Major General. Let's speak about the National Guard. Hello, dear presentees. So traditionally about the role and place of the National Guard in the repulsion of military aggression as of the 11th of August. During the week, the National Guard of Ukraine and the tasks which were defined of our superiors were done. The military units within the predefined groups of the armed forces of Ukraine are going on to take part in the defense of Slobozhansky, Donetsk, Pivdenny Bug operational districts, stabilization actions and territorial defense in Lviv, Carpathian, Bukovina and Podillia operational regions. The deterrence of the offensive of the adversary around Kharkiv, Slovyansk, Siversk cities. The defense of the cities of Kryvyi Rih, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia. In Volyn, Polisia and Siversky operational regions, in the cooperation with the State Border Service and the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the National Guard is covering the state border with the Republic of Belarus. During the stabilization operations and the accomplishment of the tasks of the territorial defense, the main forces of the National Guard are focused on the defense and protection of the important state objects, the protection of the state authorities and objects of critical infrastructure, and anti-saboteur anti-airborne reserves. Besides that, to support the land operations of the armed forces, the aviation of National Guard have had 8 helicopter sorties for the strikes of the adversary. One helicopter sortie was the aeromedical evacuation. The intelligence units have found out 279 aims of the adversary. Out of them, the observational points found 48 of them. The UAV units, 231 of them. The divers are going on observing the reservoirs at Kyiv region. They were inspecting 6.5 square kilometers of the bed of the Dnieper River. Since the beginning of the military aggression, there have been 100 square kilometers inspected, out of which 13 square kilometers of the bed of Irpin River and 87 square kilometers of the Dnieper River. So, as for the isolation restriction measures, the National Guard, in the cooperation with the National Police in the Armed Forces of Ukraine, they go on with 24/7 with the special missions at 182 checkpoints in 13 regions of Ukraine, 35 of them in Kyiv city. During the week, there have been detained 1,524 persons because of the criminal perpetrations. 8 firearms, 2 cold arms and 5 grenades have been seized. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the National Guard at the checkpoints have taken more than 25,000 of persons, among whom 392 with the suspicion in the participants in the saboteur groups of the adversary. There have been seized 154 units of firearms, more than 15,000 of ammunition for that. The cold arms, 211 units, 101 grenades, 4 grenade throwers, 22 kilos of explosions, 6 anti-tank mines, 22 artillery shells. So the examples of the successful military tasks for the week by the National Guard of Ukraine. During the air intelligence in the predefined districts, the intelligence officers have found out the concentration of the special forces of Russian Federation and the ammunition warehouse for the artillery systems, organizing the interaction with the artillery units and correcting their fire. In the short period of time, the aims were destroyed. During the night, from the 6th till the 7th of August, at one of the checkpoints of Kyiv city, the military servicemen of the National Guard of Ukraine, in the decisive actions, stopped the vehicle, the driver of which did not comply with the requirements during the curfew. So the perpetrator turned out to be the citizen of Ukraine who was already under trial for the crimes. So maybe he even stole this vehicle. To find out all of the circumstances, he was given to the investigative group of the National Police of Ukraine. We believe in our victory. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. We give the floor to all of our speakers for the Q&A session. So, dear colleagues, please take the mic and please introduce yourself. Hello, Denis Dudinsky, TV channel Belsat, Poland. Could you please tell, today we had the information that at the aerodrome, the aircraft close to Hromov in Belarus, there were several explosions. Do the armed forces of Ukraine have something to do with that? Maybe Ukrainian guerrilla, or maybe you have some other information about those explosions close to Gomel in Belarus, because the aircrafts were living there, which were launching missiles onto the territory of Ukraine during the previous weeks. And the second question is about Belarus as well. Is there any information, your personal opinion, whether the army of Lukashenko will be involved in this war on the side of Russia? Do you have any information? And I'm interested in your personal opinion. Thank you. Please. Yes, really. As for the aerodrome of Zyabryvka, there were several explosions in Belarus. Recently, the similar explosions were heard in Saki, in the Crimea. Every serviceman of the armed forces of Ukraine, every unit, should attempt to have this star for the explosions. But as for now, we have just the confirmed facts, which are commented by the Ministry of Defense of Belarus and Russia. As of whether Belarusian army will be involved in the war, we can have different forecasts. But if the same will go on, if the situation will develop like this, if the forces of good help us, the victory will be ours and will be very soon. Thank you. Any other questions? Please.
Mark Santor from the New York Times. We were told earlier today about preparations being made in Mariupol for show trials, including POWs. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you could tell us from your perspective about what you know about any possible looming trials of Ukrainian prisoners of war in Mariupol or elsewhere.
For our speakers, we had the briefing of the mayor of Mariupol, who confirmed that there is some information about the sham trial which is getting ready in Mariupol. Maybe you've got anything to comment about that. Well, we understand that so far our official representatives don't have any comments on that. Any other questions? Hello, Olga from Ukraine Forum. So going on with the question, the follow-up question, whether you have any updated information about the POWs, our defenders. Maybe you've got any information about them. The question to Ms. Mahler, maybe you could comment on that. And whether the Military of Defense, together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will initiate the letter or the declaration about this sham trial. This is the follow-up to the previous question. And the second question is to Mr. Hromov about Belarus. Is there any communication between the General Staff of Ukraine and Belarus? And maybe the Ministry of Defense are communicating? And does Belarus go on delivering ammunition and fuel to Russians? Who will begin? I would like to remind you that among the Ukrainian servicemen who were transported from Azovstal, 144 persons were liberated and they came back to Ukraine. That is about what we already accomplished. As for the persons who are still at the temporarily occupied territory, Ukraine is conducting its work, which has been conducted before, to bring back these people to Ukraine. This information and this situation really is being used by many people with different aims. But we need to base upon the facts, rely upon the facts. The facts are the following. Out of all of the evacuated, 144 persons are already coming back. Secondly, we don't have any truthful information who exactly and in what numbers died in Olenivka, because Russian Federation does not give access to this information, in spite of the appeals of Ukraine to the foreign organizations which could help us. The process is still ongoing. Thank you. There was the second question, yes, to Mr. Hromov. As of now, really, the transportation of the ammunition and military equipment is sent to the artillery systems from the warehouses of Belarus Republic to the Russian occupational troops, which are trying to accomplish their strategic aims at the east of our country. So Russian Federation on the territory of Belarus is delivering missiles Iskander S-300 and S-400, which further from Belarus are conducting shelling against our infrastructure. Yes, it is true. I can confirm that. The transportation of ammunition from Belarus Republic, in our opinion, is because of the two factors. First, those are good conditions of the warehouses in comparison with the warehouses of the central military regions of Russian Federations. And the second factor, comparatively a short time of delivery for those ammunition. As for the communication between the structures of Ukraine and Belarus, as of now, I don't know whether Republic of Belarus came to the General Staff with any requests. Everything is ahead of us, we'll see. Thank you. Any other questions left, please? Hello, my name is Anna Suspilna. The first question is about the explosions at the Crimean military aerodrome. Did the armed forces of Ukraine have anything in common with that? We know that the foreign media are disseminating the information according to their sources that the armed forces of Ukraine has something to do with that. And secondly, recently in one of the interviews, Dmytro Marchenko said that Ukraine is planning the occupation of Kherson till the end of the year and to finalize the active combat and phase of the war. I would like to ask, when do you plan the offensive? Are there any time periods, and can you say that really Kherson will be deoccupied till the end of the year and the active phase of the war will be close? Well, let's remember about that when we ask about any dates, it's a bit can be useful for our enemy. Still, don't forget that those questions can be useful for the enemy. So again, as for the aerodrome of Saki in the Crimea and the explosions which took place there, I was trying to answer the previous question of our colleague that every serviceman would wish to have something in common with those explosions. But as of now, for armed forces of Ukraine, the process is not important. The result is important. And the result is that the occupier is gradually losing its potential. That's it. As of Kherson, as of the counteroffensive, the task of the armed forces of Ukraine is to provide the integrity of the state. The integrity of the state is can be done both politically and in the military way. Our fate, we are the military, is the military way. If we have political will, if we have the certain conditions created, the armed forces of Ukraine will do what they have to, as they do now. Confidently, we will do our work. Thank you. Any other questions? Pavlo Kovalchuk, UNN. I could add a bit. As of the comment, I understand which publication you're hinting for. It was mentioned that according to some unknown source, the employee of the Minister of Defense, as if it was done by the armed forces of Ukraine. I mean the explosions. I'm urging all of you, the readers, the viewers, if in any media the most authoritative one. You can see some unknown employee of the Ministry of Defense without the name and the surname. I would recommend you not to believe, because I can confirm that the Ministry of Defense didn't have any conversations like this, because we are using the information of the General Staff, and we know that the outcome, the result, is much more important. What was mentioned by the representative of the General Staff. Not a single official confirmation is there about the armed forces which took part in that. As for the other interview you were asking about, I emphasize again, we were mentioning today about the criminal responsibility for the leakage of the information, which is done by the bloggers and journalists and some of the servicemen about the plans of the armed forces, about some of the information which they got to know from the front line. So again, I'm telling you, don't pose the questions about the operational plans of the armed forces of Ukraine, because this is the information with restricted access. No one will tell you publicly about that. Whatever was told, it can be told. Pavlo Kovalchuk, UNN. Do you observe any use of this weird coincidence, the explosions in Novofedorivka? Did the intensity of the aircraft hits decrease after this explosion there? We've observed that the adversary was trying to regroup their aircraft units, their air units to from the central part of Russia to the Crimea. I was mentioning that during my speech, and I was trying to say that we don't know what will take place later. As of now, the adversary is going on trying to accomplish their missions from the territory of the temporarily occupied Republic of Crimea, but because of the events, the intensity of the use of aircrafts in the southern direction has decreased. That is true. Thank you. Any other questions left? No questions left. I thank you. We had the general from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksii Hromov, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Hanna Mahler, and Oleksii Nadtochyi, Head of the Operations Office of the National Guard. Thank you for being with us, dear colleagues. Thank you that you're speaking truth about the war and giving the opportunity for the